What's going on, guys? Welcome to another New Bark News podcast for November 24th, 2019. As always, we're going to be covering all of the past week's gaming news, so sit back and relax as we spruce up the start to your upcoming week. Walmart is going big in their Black Friday ad. On the gaming side, it features a fantastic PlayStation 4 deal we'd covered last week, as well as the one for the PlayStation 4 Pro. The latest Walmart ad details that you can get a PlayStation 4 Pro with Call of Duty Modern Warfare for just $300. That's, of course, not the end of the deals, though, as you can also pick up Xbox One and PlayStation 4 controllers for their Black Friday prices right now from Walmart. Most of the video game deals won't go live until November 27th, but you can get Call of Duty Modern Warfare for its lowest Black Friday price of $38 right now from Walmart. But Best Buy won't be leaving you out in the cold either. Best Buy has quite a few great deals in its Black Friday sale, which includes offers on a great PlayStation 4 bundle with 3 excellent games, huge price cuts on the Xbox One S and Xbox One X consoles, and much more. Brass Lion Entertainment is a new studio comprised of former Mass Effect, Bethesda, and Sleeping Dogs developers, and is focused on delivering games that explore diversity of voices and cultures. Former Mass Effect senior gameplay designer Manveer Hare said that he wasn't getting out of game design entirely, but that he wanted to focus on new types of stories, ones that focused on diverse voices. The team's first project is Corner Wolves, a narrative-focused game set in 1990s Harlem. In addition to video games, the studio is also poised to create film, television, and other media. Something of note here is that DJ and Jay-Z producer Just Blaze has signed a contract with Brass Lion to help design Corner Wolves' musical tone, and the Rise of Black Panther writer is penning the game's story. In more somewhat breaking news, Valve can almost count to 3. Almost. Earlier this week, Valve unveiled Half-Life Alyx, its first flagship virtual reality game. It will be compatible with most of the major VR gaming headsets when it launches in March 2020, including Valve Index, Oculus Rift, Oculus Quest through PC Link, HTC Vive, and Windows Mixed Reality. A huge perk for Valve Index owners is that they will get Half-Life Alyx for free, while everyone else will have to purchase it for $60, or its current pre-order discounted 10% off price of $54. There will also be Index-exclusive content, such as gun skins, Steam VR home spaces with environments from the game, and themed content for Counter-Strike Global Offensive. However, you'll need to buy an Index by the end of 2019 to qualify for that content. I strongly encourage you guys to check out the trailer for this game. It does look fantastic. I mean, maybe it's just the nostalgia for me of seeing a new installment of Half-Life, but I am almost there to buying a Valve Index just to try it out. Other recently announced games include Path of Exile, the free-to-play game that has, for many players, usurped Diablo as the premier grimdark monster-mashing loot fest, is officially getting a sequel. Announced November 15th, the aptly titled Path of Exile 2 was originally set to be a large update to the first game, but is now being billed as a full sequel. There's no release date yet, and it's still a ways off. Developer Grinding Gear is saying players shouldn't expect a beta until, quote, at least very late 2020, unquote. It will include a whole new 7-act campaign, a new skill gem system, new ascendancy classes, and of course, heaps of new equipment and other loot. Breaking news! Stadia sucks! I've run out of fear for Stadia, and I'm sure many of you have as well. What was once so proudly relished by Google is now a footnote at best due to a combination of poor marketing, a lackluster launch lineup, and of course, technical difficulties. The latest of which centers around the fact that a fair bit of those who pre-ordered access to the streaming service say that they haven't even gotten logged on. Instead, they find themselves waiting for an email from Google with their login information, even after the video game streaming service is launched. While some who pre-ordered Stadia's Founders Edition received their controller, Chromecast Ultra, and membership info, others are still waiting, either for their order to ship, for emails with instructions for setting up their account, or both. 2 days after launch, Google now says that Stadia access codes have gone out to everyone who pre-ordered Stadia in June. It's worth noting that these are only the access codes to log in and start using Stadia. Actual pre-order packages containing the controller and special Chromecast Ultras are still in the process of being shipped. Speaking of streaming services, Microsoft's Project xCloud began its beta last month with only 4 games being accessible. Now there are over 50. Currently, the service streams games from Microsoft servers to a smartphone or tablet and requires a Bluetooth controller, Xbox One or otherwise, to start playing. In the future, Microsoft plans for xCloud to also stream to PCs, support touch controls, and carry save data over seamlessly from your main Xbox console. While the current version is pretty bare bones, the straightforwardness is nice. Just start up the app, select a game, and start playing. However, so far it reportedly feels like a diet streaming service, mainly due to technical hiccups and the like. A Kotaku author reports that in a day, xCloud used 2.54 gigabytes of data for somewhere just over an hour of usage. The hardest thing about getting a firm grasp of any streaming technology is isolating all of the other variables involved. In xCloud's case, that's the phone, cell provider's coverage and signal strength, as well as the Bluetooth connection to the controller. Ironing out all of those kinks seems like a monumental task for a single company, even one of the big ones such as Microsoft or Google. Overall, citing performance and technical hiccups at the moment, Project xCloud seems ideal for casually trying something out, as its expansive game library is currently its biggest sell. Moving on with the Microsoft beat, we're also covering Philly Spence and his box of goods. The box of goods being the widely promoted Xbox Project Scarlett. Microsoft is not looking to repeat the mistakes from Xbox One with its next-generation Xbox console. Microsoft's Xbox and gaming chief, Phil Spencer, in an interview with The Verge says, quote, "I would say a learning from the Xbox One generation is we will not be out of position on power or price. If you remember the beginning of this generation, we were $100 more expensive and yes, we were less powerful. And we started Project Scarlett with this leadership team in place with a goal of having market success." Unquote. That market success will be key for Xbox. After years of falling behind PlayStation sales and questions over its games lineup, either way, Spencer believes that there are plenty of generations of Xbox ahead, saying, quote, "We had the discussion years ago. Do we want to go another generation? Yes. And do we think that there will be multiple generations ahead of us? I actually think there probably is. So we're going all in. We're all in on Project Scarlett, and I want to compete. I want to compete in the right ways, which is why we're focused on crossplay and backward compatibility." Unquote. Well, I'll say that Sony could certainly learn from something in those regards. It isn't unlikely that Project Scarlett will be using those aspects to its advantage. I know that for me, that was one of the biggest sells for why I purchased an Xbox One over a PlayStation 4. A surprising amount of others seem perfectly fine with simply abandoning a console generation and losing access to games they've put hundreds of hours into. But not me. That's just my hot take on it, but if you have a different one, please feel free to leave a comment. The Nintendo Switch port of Alien Isolation will be released on December 5th, 2019. The Nintendo Switch port will come with all 7 downloadable content add-ons. I don't actually know how I feel about this. This is one of those games where I ask myself, why the Switch? I mean, Alien Isolation is one of those games that you'd be playing in a very dark room with high-quality surround sound, ready to get the pants scared off of you by one of the game's graphically intense terrors. The Nintendo Switch, however, is meant to be played on a crowded bus with your friends. It's just weird to me that somebody would play a game like that on a Switch in the first place, much less on the go. And yeah, you could try and get the same experience by docking your Switch and turning off all the lights and such, but the visuals you're going to get out of it won't be up to par with the same game being run on other platforms. I don't know, I try not to judge games too harshly on graphics and whatnot, but this appears to be one of those times where the overall experience of the game is mostly reliant on visuals. Let me know your thoughts in the comments.
And On this upcoming Black Friday Eve, I will proudly sacrifice my Xbone S to the PlayStation overlords in the name of the great Sony. Wait a minute, are we recording the news segment? Logan, you should have told me! So after that embarrassing incident, well, you probably can all assume what I'm going to be starting off my section of this week's news broadcast with. Oh, is it Sony, senpai? So, starting off this week's PlayStation news segment, we've gained some more information regarding Sony's cartridge patent filing discussed last week. Let's Go Digital found that the cartridge patent, whose filing in Brazil triggered last week's discussion, had been initially filed in Japan on December 28, 2019. More detailed images seem to have emerged alongside the Japanese patent filing, revealing 12 connection pins on the outside of the cartridge and 8 connection pins on the cartridge's internal chip. Alongside these more detailed images, Sony Interactive Entertainment Japan also gave the following description. Quote, "This is a recording medium which can record various data, such as a character, an image, an animation, a sound, and a program. By loading the opening provided by the game console with the tip and part by which a variety of pins of this cartridge were provided, the various data recorded on this cartridge can be read." Unquote. This description confirms the cartridge is indeed for a game system and not something such as the Sony TOIO toy as some had previously speculated. Additionally, the description also matches the functionality that an SSD would serve for a game system in the modern age of game installation to a hard drive. When this information is factored in with Sony touting what they believe to be a desirable price point for the PlayStation 5 and the already announced proprietary SSDs the system will be utilizing, all information seems to point towards these cartridges being memory expansions for the system. This would allow for a lower price point of the system at launch, since it could have lower overall storage, and a lower price point would then entice more people to move to the platform faster, which is something Sony has repeatedly emphasized as being a top priority for them. The downside to this is, when Sony has been the lone seller of expandable storage for their systems in the past, these storage mediums have often proved to be more expensive than consumer-grade counterparts, such as the PlayStation Vita memory cards. If these probable higher costs are the price of the supposedly lightning-fast load times the console will provide, perhaps it is worth it. Speaking of the PlayStation Vita, it is also notable for a big fan such as myself that this additional information doesn't in any way rule out the possibility of the cartridge being for a new handheld from Sony, though the possibility remains sadly unlikely given Sony's apathy towards wanting to compete in the portable gaming market again. Now let's return for a moment to Sony's repeated emphasis on the PlayStation 5 price point being desirable for consumers, as we received a Twitter post claiming to be a leaked price point for the PlayStation 5. This post comes from a user who had previously leaked the first release date we were given for The Last of Us Part 2, and who is known for leaking PlayStation news by the name of PS Erebus. However, it is important to note that this user also has relatively few followers and remains anonymous, so their credibility is always in question for such leaks. That being said, PS Erebus claims the PlayStation 5 will launch on November 20th, 2020 in the US at $499. This information would coincide with what information we have from Sony on the system regarding its release. November 2020 can be equated to holiday 2020, and then for the price, the Xbox One X has already warmed the consumer market up to a $500 price tag for a home gaming system, and given the beefy specs Sony is claiming their next generation platform will have, the company is likely selling the system at a loss even at $500, which means us consumers are the ones winning out in the purchase. This may be a reflection of the desirable price point Sony has claimed their platform will have for consumers. Additionally, selling the platform at a loss also follows a historical trend for Sony, as both of their previous two home consoles, PlayStations 3 and 4, were initially sold at a loss as well. With all of that being said, none of this supposed leak is necessarily too outlandish, but that also doesn't necessarily equate to confirmation of it being true either. Continuing a discussion of PlayStation 5 information, the Video Game Chronicle reported earlier this week on discovered PlayStation 5 controller patent images. These images were published by the Japanese Patent Office on November 18, 2019, and showcased a controller whose differences from the DualShock 4 were very subtle, as was previously indicated by those with development kits who had spoken on the controller. Noticeable differences between the controller and its predecessor include what seems to be the lack of a light bar, the joysticks are slightly smaller, the triggers are slightly larger, the grips seem to sport a width more similar to that of an Xbox One controller than the DualShock 4, The seam where the controller's plastics are connected has been shifted from being towards the lower half of where the controller is gripped, facing the person actually using the controller, more so to a typical place halfway between the top and bottom of the controller. And then, according to Toshi Aoki, the controller's product manager, the controller's weight will fall between that of an Xbox One controller with batteries in it and the current DualShock 4. It is also of note that the touchpad appears to be making a necessary return, as without it, backwards compatibility for PlayStation 4 games that utilized it may not be fully possible. In contrast, Sony has talked several times now on how the current model of PlayStation VR will be compatible with PlayStation 5, which proves interesting since the current model makes use of the DualShock 4's light bar, a feature seemingly absent on these patent images. That being said, perhaps for VR games that use the light bar, players will need to use a DualShock 4 controller on the PlayStation 5, or perhaps Sony has found another workaround to allow these newer gamepads to also communicate with their VR system, with the battery-devouring light on the front not being necessary. In all of these subtle changes present, we must also remember that none of this is final, and in the past, Sony has changed their controllers relatively close to launch, such as the shift away from the boomerang controller model for the PlayStation 3. All of that being said, it is likely safe to assume the overall shape of the controller, the symmetric joysticks, and other standard issue features of every PlayStation controller are likely to remain in place, as even this patent would suggest. Next up is yet another Sony patent to be filed, this time specifically dealing with the ability to share save states with other players, and what sounds like being able to create your own demos for games you own for other players. PlayStation Universe reports that part of the patent's description reads as follows, quote, "A method for sharing a gameplay experience is provided, including executing a game by a cloud gaming system, wherein executing the video game includes processing a game state of the video game to provide gameplay of the video game, streaming the gameplay of the video game over a network, the gameplay of the video game being defined for a first user, receiving a command to share an interactive playable portion from the gameplay of the video game, responsive to the command, sharing the interactive playable portion of the video game through a social interface, the social interface thus enabling access for gameplay of the interactive playable portion by a second user." So based off my best interpretation of this patent jargon, it sounds as though one would be able to upload the save state of their game to the cloud and grant permission to other users to play on their save state via the cloud. This could be an interesting feature to allow users to share discovered Easter eggs in games, seek help on areas they may be stuck, and even possibly more directly share bugs found within the game with the developers, if the developers could pick up the state from right where the bug starts. Secondly, in terms of players being able to create demos, it sounds as though one can isolate a section of a game, think of like cutting part of a piece of paper out with scissors, likely restricted by a time window or something along those lines, and then share it with others via the cloud to be able to test the game. This latter feature sounds especially consumer-friendly, as it would allow friends to share aspects of their games with one another without needing to lend discs, or necessarily deal with long install times on a game before deciding if they want to play it. Where this could be problematic, or even too good to be true, is that what prevents users from stringing together enough demos of different sections of a game in such a way that one could experience the entire game through a string of demos? This is something developers certainly wouldn't want to deal with, so if this patent comes to fruition, there are certain to be a number of restrictions on how these demos are made. Moving along from patents to possible games for the PlayStation 5, many fans of Final Fantasy and MMOs have found a home this console generation in the expansive world of Final Fantasy XIV. Since the PlayStation 5 has already been confirmed to be backwards compatible, current users need not worry about being able to play the game on new hardware. But what about those seeking a version of the game that fully capitalizes on said new hardware's capabilities? According to the Final Fantasy UK fans Twitter page at a recent fan event for the game, its producer and director, Naoki Yoshida, said the following, quote, "We are hard at work on the PlayStation 5 version of Final Fantasy XIV, aiming to make it a reality for fans around the world," unquote. Final Fantasy IP owner Square Enix was quick to reply to the supposed confirmation of a PlayStation 5 version of the game, stating that, quote, "While not a confirmation, Yoshida-san expressed a hope that Final Fantasy XIV Online may one day appear on the next generation of Sony consoles. All this would make sense as Square Enix followed a similar pattern during the transition of their player base from the PlayStation 3 to the PlayStation 4, providing PlayStation 3 support for the game up until 2017, well after its successor had launched, and even providing a free upgrade for the game's player base to the PlayStation 4 version when PS3 support was shut down. Regardless of how this plays out, fans of the game on Sony's platforms sound like they have nothing to worry about in terms of being able to continue playing on their consoles into the future. To wrap up our PlayStation news coverage for this week, keep your ears peeled on November 27th as Sony is set to announce the final free PlayStation Plus games of the year. Current rumors suggest such titles as The Last Colossus and God of War being possible, both of which being commendable PlayStation exclusives and could continue Sony's recent upward trend in the quality of their free games provided each month. Be sure to let us know in the comments section down below what games you would like to, realistically, see come to PlayStation Plus in the future. Now, speaking of paying for things online that you only get digitally or as some sort of a quote-unquote online service, Gearbox has announced that Borderlands 3's first campaign DLC will be arriving on December 19th later this year. Titled Moxie's Heist of the Handsome Jackpot, it is to focus around a raid on Handsome Jack's old space station turned shut-down casino for any treasure that may be remaining. The DLC's base level scaling will be for players level 13, but players further along need not worry as enemies in the game will scale to your level. As with campaign DLCs in the series' previous games, this one will feature new skins to be discovered for characters, numerous side quests, and new loot including legendary weapons that may only be found within this DLC. As an avid fan of Borderlands, should this DLC live up to the quality of the ones in the earlier entries of the series, fans have much to look forward to, including expanded lore and character development in the fan-favorite shooter-looter franchise. Moving right along to a story that managed to even warm my ice-cold heart, following the reality-shattering surprise mechanic-free launch of Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order last week, it was discovered that one of the game's Easter eggs was a tribute to level designer Nicholas G. Cameron's father, Martin, or as his friends called him, Bucky Cameron. Reported on by Luke Plunkett of Kotaku, Martin had also been an employee for LucasArts before he passed last year, having worked on many of the company's classic projects including Monkey Island and X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter. In the game, Martin appears via an Echo device on an iconic snowy planet that isn't named, under the name Marti Bucky Kamran, a heartwarming way for a son to portray his deceased father for sure. Subtleties such as this, when mixed with solid gameplay and positive fan reception to Respawn's latest project, can give Star Wars fans such as myself hope for the future of the franchise in games. Now, speaking of game franchises that people have wanted to have been made, great again, I suppose? Does everyone remember the famous, quote, playable teaser, unquote, otherwise known as PT, that was available to download on the PlayStation Store a few years back? That thing that was supposedly a Silent Hill successor? You know, the demo that once removed from the store made people's systems that had it installed grow exponentially in value. That playable teaser happened to be made by a certain Kojima production studio under the pseudonym 7780 Studio, and Digital Trends reports on how studio head Hideo Kojima recently referenced the horror masterpiece again on Twitter. Quote, "As to make the scariest horror game, I'll watch the scary movies in order to awaken my horror soul. The Eye is the Thai horror movie I rented while making PT, but was too scary to finish watching. The package is scary, so I rented the disc only. Will I be able to finish watching?" Quote, "This comes with interesting timing, as in an October interview with Rocket Beats Gaming, Kojima expressed his interest in having Kojima Productions one day work on a horror game, having stated, quote, 'I want to do a horror game one day, yes, of course. I have some new ideas that I think kind of get out there, but I don't know when. I'll have to think about when I bring this out,' unquote." In the same interview, Kojima goes on to discuss the delicate balance that needs to be found in horror-based video games, as unlike movies, players cannot be scared still or they will never complete the experience. Recall that Konami also had a hand in the making of PT, so a direct sequel or full realization of the game's concepts is unlikely because of intellectual property legalities. Is it possible that Kojima could be working on some sort of a spiritual successor to the game? After all, it was a few months before the release of the divisive Death Stranding that Kojima stated his studio had begun the early phases of work on their next project. Given that timing, the studio realizing what general direction their next project was going, such as a game, maybe horror, could certainly line up with when the interview was done. So with all that being said, fans of Kojima or the Silent Hill series or just horror in general may have something to look forward to coming up quite soon. Seeing as how Kojima made only the second most talked about game preceding its launch this year, it only makes sense to move on to the most talked about pre-launch game of the year, Pokémon Sword and Shield. Leading up to the launch of these games were various controversies, including the absence of the complete roster of Pokemon from the series' past, the graphics not being as stunning as they possibly could be, the game mechanics shifting too much or too little, etc, etc, etc. Basically, if you name a primary feature of the game, it seemed to divide the fanbase in some way or another leading up to its launch. Now, with that being said, despite all this, Pokemon continues to flex its muscles as one of the most profitable IPs in entertainment, as Sword and Shield rose above the controversy to become the fastest-selling Switch game worldwide in its debut week. That's right, despite all the complaints about the national decks, everything else, sales of this game are still the fastest of any Switch title so far to launch. This matches historical sales trends for Pokemon, as when the last new generation of Pokemon debuted on the 3DS, being Sun and Moon, those games went on to sell just shy of 15 million copies within 3 months of launching. This certainly leads one to wonder if all of the controversy was led by a highly vocal minority rather than a large sum of individuals. Leading up to the game's launch, one of the most highly controversial subjects people talked about was the slimming of the roster of available Pokemon within the games. For those who may be frustrated by the incomplete roster, and who are willing to use some, we'll say, less conventional methods to play these games, a modder by the name of Sears M of Project Pokemon has already managed to add a missing Omastar to the game. Sears M has said that the Omastar's character model and animations were ripped from the Let's Go games, and while it doesn't support all of the features of the Pokemon Game Freak put in the game themselves, the possibility certainly exists, especially with Omastar being able to be coded in at a basic level so quickly. The good news of this is that for those seeking to complete the Pokemon roster in Sword and Shield, it sounds like if modders are given enough time, this will likely be possible. The bad news is that Pokemon outside of Generation 1 who are missing will be much harder to add to the game, since their assets don't already exist in the form of a Switch code from the Let's Go games. As an avid Pokemon fan myself who was yet to play Sword and Shield, I'm at least happy to see that this may be an option for those looking for their favorite old monsters, even if it may take quite some time. And for the last bit of news covered by yours truly, well, Google's bankruptcy plan, Google Stadia, launched earlier this week with mixed reactions on just about everything, and even managed to spawn the Chromecast Ultra toaster oven product line. Regardless, the platform, if it can even be called that, doesn't seem to have necessarily made the waves Google may have been hoping for, which proves interesting given how every tech giant seems eager to dip their toes in the waters of game streaming right now. Quoting apparently Amazon, that's right, a job listing was discovered on their Amazon Web Services site with the following description, quote, Amazon is all in on games. We believe the evolution that began with arcade communities a quarter at a time, growing to the live streams and esports of today, will continue to a future where everyone is a gamer and every gamer can create, compete, collaborate, and connect with others at massive scales. If you share our belief that games will produce some of the future's most influential voices in media and art, and want to help developers around the world succeed and build these next generation games, come join us, unquote. This coincides well with claims made by CNET that Amazon will be announcing a game streaming service of their own sometime next year to compete with the PlayStation 5 and Project Scarlet. This also follows 2 job listings that The Verge had uncovered back in January by Amazon for 2 cloud gaming engineers. This all seems to hint that Amazon likely is working towards some sort of streaming service of their own. The massive company does already have a game studio that has been up and running for over 5 years by the name of Amazon Game Studios, although their only release to come to a non-mobile platform was 2019's The Grand Tour game, a release I'd certainly never heard of before working on this story. Additionally, where Google owns Stadia has YouTube as a complementary platform, Amazon owns the lead game streaming platform, Twitch. With Twitch under their belt, Amazon could likely replicate many of the features Stadia claims it will one day be able to have work between YouTube and Stadia. These include being able to jump right into your favorite streamer's game and streaming latency free from the game services to the game streaming site. It is also worth pointing out that Amazon already owns considerable real estate on the internet via Amazon Web Services, which already supports several processes such as Fortnite servers. In essence, they've already got a rather robust architecture outlined that not everybody trying to dip their toes into the streaming services necessarily already has. With all of these features and having time to see where Stadia may fall short for consumers, we must then ask if Amazon has a strong enough hand of assets and knowledge to start the push towards a game streaming focused future, or if they will fall flat on their faces to a competitor, especially with Project xCloud already sporting a robust library of games in its beta phase, Game Pass integration, and favorable reviews from beta testers. As a physical media buff, I personally don't like the taste left in my mouth of any company trying to push towards a Netflix-style game future, but at this point, even I must often ask if such a future is inevitable, as so many leaders of the industry seem to be trying to force it upon us. With this one, unfortunately, only
And that's it for this week's podcast, guys. Feel free to leave any constructive criticism in the comments below as well. And we at New Bark Network wish you a great start to your upcoming week.